Today, we're diving into a case for the historical existence of Jesus. But, it comes with a twist you might not expect. This isn't just about faith. It's really about history, sociology, and what happens when two totally different worldviews collide. So this is the big question, right? It's one that has fascinated and, let's be honest, divided people for centuries. What if we just set aside theology for a minute and look purely at the historical record? What does it actually say? Well, that's exactly what this source tries to figure out.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the basic question of existence. Then, we'll look at evidence from Roman historians, people who were there at the time. After that, we'll get into the source's really unique argument about the real beef with Rome. We'll also address a big counter-theory, and we'll wrap up with a question that might just change how you see the whole debate.
Okay, let's dive right in. How do you even begin to approach a figure like Jesus from a purely historical perspective? I mean, how do you peel back 2,000 years of art, religion, and interpretation to get to the person?
The scholar Bart Ehrman really nails the challenge with this quote. The thing is, to understand the historical Jesus, we have to put him back in his world, not try to drag him into ours. So the whole investigation has to start not with faith, but with a specific person who lived in a specific place at a specific time.
And here's the first big logical point the source makes. Think about the intensity of that early Christian movement. You had thousands of people willing to lose everything, their property, their freedom, even their lives. That suggests a really powerful, real catalyst. It's a huge ask for people to do that when they have no official church, no formal Bible, and supposedly no actual founder to rally around.
Okay, so if the dedication of his followers is one piece of the puzzle, what about outsiders? What about non-Christian sources? What did the Romans, the guys in charge, have to say about this new movement and the man who started it all?
Our first witness is a man named Tacitus, and he's a big deal. He was a Roman senator, one of their most respected historians. And here's the key. He was not a friend to Christians, which makes what he wrote only about 80 years after the crucifixion so incredibly important.
So while he's blaming Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, Tacitus just casually drops these bombshell historical details. He's not trying to prove Jesus existed, he's just giving background information. But look at what he says. He names the founder, Christus, connects him directly to the governor Pontius Pilate, and confirms it all happened under the Emperor Tiberius.
So let's just break that down. In this one little passage, from a guy who couldn't stand them, we get 4 key pieces of information. It backs up the who, when, where, and how of the central event in the Gospels. And it confirms that by 64 AD, there was a group in Rome different enough to be used as a scapegoat.
Next up, we have Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman magistrate, basically a governor. And he had a bit of a problem. People in his province kept getting accused of being Christians, and he had no idea what the official company policy was. So he writes a letter to his boss, the Emperor Trajan, asking for advice. And in that letter, Pliny gives us this incredible snapshot of what early Christians were actually doing, all from an outsider's point of view. He sees them worshiping Christ like a god, and, this is important, he notes they bind themselves to this really strict ethical code. It's like we're getting a peek into the early church through the eyes of Roman law enforcement.
And it doesn't stop there. There are other mentions too. The Jewish historian Josephus, in a passage most scholars accept, mentions the execution of James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and straight up identifies him as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Then the Roman historian Suetonius talks about a guy named Chrestus stirring up trouble in Rome decades earlier. You put it all together, and it paints a pretty clear picture of a real person whose followers were definitely on the radar of both Roman and Jewish authorities.
Okay, so if even non-biblical sources seem to confirm his existence, why were his followers so despised? This is where the source makes its most compelling and honestly its most unusual argument. It claims the conflict wasn't just about what Christians believed, it was about how they lived.
The source coins a specific term for this, pure religion. Now, this had nothing to do with big cathedrals or fancy rituals. It was a grassroots social safety net, a private, voluntary system that cared for the widows, the orphans, and the poor inside their own communities. And here you can see the two systems side by side, and they couldn't be more different.
On one side, you have the Christians with their voluntary network built on charity. And on the other, you've got the Roman Empire's public religion, which was a state-run welfare system funded by taxes and force, and it required you to show loyalty to Caesar and the state gods.
So this brings us to the core claim. The real crime of the early Christians wasn't heresy. It was opting out. By refusing to take the government's free bread and by creating their own parallel society, they were seen as a direct threat to the emperor's authority and control. And you know what? It wasn't just Christians who are suspicious of this. This quote from the historian Plutarch shows that some Romans themselves saw these state handouts not as charity, but as a tool for control. It was a way to keep the population dependent and quiet. But wait, what about the theory that Jesus was just a complete fabrication? An invention of the Roman state itself? Well, the source takes on one of the most well-known versions of this idea head-on.
It's called the Flavian myth, and it basically suggests that the Flavian dynasty of Roman emperors actually hired people to write the Gospels. The goal was to create a peaceful, turn-the-other-cheek Messiah to calm down Jewish rebellions. It's a fascinating idea, but the source argues it just doesn't hold up when you really look at it.
And here's the rebuttal, broken down into 3 massive contradictions. First, oaths. Why would Roman propagandists write, "Swear not at all," when the Flavians demanded a public oath of loyalty from everyone? Second, fatherhood. Why would they write, "Call no man on earth your father," when the emperor's official title was Patronus, the father of the nation? And third, welfare. Why on earth would a Roman-sponsored text include Jesus' harsh criticism of the Korban, a state-run welfare system that was basically a carbon copy of their own? The teachings just seem tailor-made to undermine Roman power, not to support it.
So all this brings us to our final section. We're pivoting now from historical proof to a much bigger, more philosophical question. If Jesus was real, and if his main conflict with Rome was about these competing social systems, what does that actually mean for us?
This slide really lays out the ultimate showdown. I mean, think about it. Both Jesus and Caesar were called Son of God and Savior, but their methods were polar opposites. Jesus offered salvation through personal change and voluntary charity, which set people free. Caesar offered salvation through state benefits and military force, which created dependency. One kingdom was based on moral law, the other was built on the army.
And here is the source's final and maybe most provocative conclusion. It argues that over the centuries, many people who claim to follow Jesus have actually abandoned his model of pure religion, that voluntary, independent network of care, and have instead embraced the Roman model of looking to the state as the main provider and savior.
And that's where we land. The argument for Jesus' existence isn't just an academic debate. It's a way to shine a light on 2 completely different ways of seeing the world. And it leaves us with a really tough question. Is simply believing that a man named Jesus existed 2,000 years ago the same thing as actually understanding and living by the radical, anti-authoritarian social system he preached? Something to think about.